Let me ask you a question that almost nobody covering this story has actually asked out loud. If this Iran deal is genuinely finished, genuinely signed, genuinely the achievement the White House keeps calling it, why would anyone inside that same administration already be quietly discussing a second, different deal to replace it? That's not a hypothetical. According to new reporting out this week, there is now a real possibility being discussed that Donald Trump may abandon the current understanding with Iran after the November midterm elections and pursue an entirely new agreement in its place. I want to spend the next half hour walking through why that report matters far more than a single throwaway line buried in a foreign newspaper, what it tells you about the actual durability of the deal currently in place, and why the timing tied to the midterm specifically is the most important detail in the entire story. I want to walk you through four things today. First, what the current deal actually says, and specifically which parts of it have already drawn real criticism from inside the president's own political coalition. Second, why a report like this, suggesting the administration itself may be quietly planning a do-over, is a fundamentally different kind of signal than ordinary political criticism from outside the White House. Third, what the midterm election timeline specifically does to the political incentives surrounding this deal between now and November. And fourth, what I think happens next, because I'm not going to leave you with just an autopsy. I want to leave you with a forecast. Before we get into this report specifically, I want to give you some historical grounding, because this pattern, a signed agreement that starts facing quiet internal reconsideration almost immediately after signature, is not new. And understanding the pattern tells you a great deal about how seriously to take a report like this one. Go back to Trump's own history with the 2015 nuclear agreement negotiated by the previous Democratic administration. That deal was signed, celebrated internationally, and then spent years facing sustained political attack from exactly the coalition that now finds itself governing again, eventually leading to American withdrawal years later. The lesson from that episode that's relevant here isn't about the substance of that particular deal. It's about the mechanism. An agreement that resolves an immediate crisis can still remain politically contested indefinitely afterward, particularly when meaningful factions within the government that signed it never fully accepted its terms in the first place. What determines whether that contestation eventually produces a formal reversal isn't usually a single dramatic event. It's whether the coalition unhappy with the deal gains enough institutional power through elections or through shifting internal administration dynamics to actually act on that unhappiness. Keep that pattern in mind, because it's exactly the dynamic this new reporting suggests may already be quietly underway. I also don't want to skip past a specific piece of this deal that's drawn the sharpest criticism, because it directly connects to why a post-election renegotiation might specifically appeal to the coalition currently unhappy with the agreement. Iran successfully linked this broader understanding with events unfolding in Lebanon, effectively tying American and Israeli latitude to continue operations against Hezbollah to the broader Iran framework staying intact. Israeli officials have been notably uncomfortable with this linkage from the moment it became public, viewing it as Washington tying their hands on a separate front, while Iran continues supporting Hezbollah covertly, regardless of what any ceasefire language says on paper. That specific grievance, that the deal quietly constrains Israeli operational freedom in exchange for concessions many in Israel view as insufficient on the actual nuclear question, is exactly the kind of criticism that tends to generate sustained political pressure over time, rather than fading quickly, particularly given Israel's own upcoming domestic elections and the intensity of feeling this issue generates among American lawmakers who prioritize the U.S.-Israel relationship. Let's talk about what the current deal actually contains, separated from the celebratory framing it received at signing. The agreement, reached in mid-June after a war that closed the Strait of Hormuz and rattled global energy markets for roughly 3.5 months, reopened the strait and lifted the American naval blockade in exchange for a set of Iranian commitments that remain, by design, only partially resolved. Iran agreed to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium in exchange for sanctions relief, with the specific mechanism for how that uranium would actually be disposed of left to a subsequent 60-day negotiating window, during which some would reportedly be diluted and the rest transferred to a third country. The deal also included a proposed fund of at least $300 billion for Iran's reconstruction and economic development, structured, according to the administration's own account, around private sector and regional partner financing, rather than direct American taxpayer money, though that structuring did little to blunt the political criticism the number itself generated once it became public. The $300 billion figure specifically deserves its own moment of scrutiny, because of how much political ammunition it's already generated, regardless of how it ends up actually being funded. Democratic critics seized immediately on the number, framing it as a staggering giveaway to a regime still associated by many Americans with hostility toward the United States and its allies, while administration officials, including the vice president, moved quickly to clarify that no American taxpayer money would be directly involved, and that the funding would instead rely on private sector and regional partner capital, with the United Arab Emirates cited as one example of an interested outside investor. That clarification did little to fully neutralize the political damage, because the headline figure itself, regardless of its funding mechanism, became a durable talking point precisely because it's simple, large, and easy to repeat. A number that large, attached to a deal already facing internal skepticism from the president's own party, doesn't need to be technically inaccurate to function as a genuine political liability heading into a midterm cycle, where every dollar of perceived foreign largesse becomes fodder for attack ads on both sides of the aisle. This is exactly the kind of deal that reads, on paper, as resolving an acute crisis while deferring nearly every genuinely difficult question to a later date. And several of Trump's own Republican allies noticed that immediately. Senators including Roger Wicker, Lindsey Graham, and Ted Cruz have publicly balked at aspects of the deal, arguing the terms look uncomfortably similar to the very 2015 agreement Trump himself scrapped during his first term, the same agreement his own coalition spent a decade attacking as a capitulation to Tehran. That's not a minor irony. That's a direct structural tension sitting inside the president's own political base from the moment this deal was announced. And it's precisely the tension this week's new reporting suggests may now be shaping actual strategic planning inside the administration, rather than remaining simply background grumbling from a handful of senators. I also don't want to skip past just how chaotic the road to this specific deal actually was, because it's directly relevant to how much confidence anyone should place in its permanence. This wasn't a negotiation that proceeded in a straight line toward resolution. Trump publicly declared at one point that there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. Weeks later, reports emerged that the administration was preparing peace talks built around 6 specific demands, several of which Iran had already previously rejected. At another point, Trump threatened to attack Iran's power plants and bridges if the strait wasn't reopened, followed shortly afterward by a rejected Iranian counterproposal, followed by an escalating threat that an entire civilization would be destroyed if no agreement was reached, a statement administration officials later described as improvisational, rather than reflecting any actual national security plan. One network's independent count found that Trump claimed a deal was imminent at least 38 separate times across roughly 3 months before an actual agreement was finally reached. I'm walking you through that specific history not to relitigate the negotiation itself, but because a deal that emerged from this much volatility, this much reversal, and this much rhetorical excess carries a fundamentally different kind of political DNA than a deal negotiated through patient, consistent, single-track diplomacy. Volatile origins tend to produce volatile aftermaths, and everything about how this specific agreement came together suggests its post-signature life was always going to be contested rather than settled. Now, why does a report suggesting the administration itself might revisit this deal carry more weight than ordinary outside criticism? This is a distinction worth sitting with carefully. Criticism from senators, even prominent ones, is a normal, constant feature of any major foreign policy agreement, and administrations routinely absorb that kind of criticism without it meaningfully altering their actual course. What's being reported here is categorically different. It's not simply that critics exist, it's that the administration itself, according to new information cited by this report, may already be weighing whether to treat the current deal as a temporary bridge rather than a permanent settlement, with an eye toward renegotiating on more favorable terms once the political calendar creates more room to do so. If accurate, that's not criticism of the deal. That's the deal's own architects hedging on its durability before the ink has even had time to fully dry, which raises an obvious and uncomfortable question about how much confidence anyone, including Iran itself, should actually place in the commitments this agreement contains. I also want to widen the lens briefly to the economic backdrop shaping all of this, because it's easy to lose sight of just how directly this deal's fate connects to kitchen-table political pressures heading into November. The war that preceded this agreement sent shockwaves through global oil markets and affected global growth projections for months. And while the ceasefire and reopening of the strait did bring prices down from their peak, energy costs and broader inflation concerns remain a live, central issue for the American electorate heading into the midterms. Any renewed instability around Iran between now and November, whether from a stalled technical negotiation, a collapse of the ceasefire framework, or a public admission that the deal is being reconsidered, carries genuine risk of feeding directly back into exactly the kind of price pressure Republicans are most anxious about avoiding before voters go to the polls. That's precisely why the timing logic I described earlier holds up as strongly as it does. The economic incentive to keep this deal looking stable through November is not abstract. It's directly tied to the same fuel and grocery prices that Republican strategists are already watching nervously in their own internal polling. Let's follow the actual political mechanics here, because this is where the video earns its title. Why specifically after the midterm elections, and why does that timing matter as much as it does? The answer sits in a comment Trump himself made recently, in a cabinet meeting, when he insisted that November's midterm elections won't factor into how he shapes his approach to the Iran situation. He said, in his own words as reported at the time, that Iran was negotiating on fumes, and that critics who thought they could simply outweight him past the midterms were mistaken. I want you to notice what that statement actually reveals, independent of whether you take it at face value. A president doesn't need to insist publicly that an election isn't shaping his strategy, unless the possibility that it is shaping his strategy has already become salient enough, inside his own political circles, that it needed to be addressed directly. Denials of this specific kind are rarely offered about considerations nobody was actually weighing. Here's the structural logic of why the midterms specifically create exactly the kind of pressure that would make a post-election renegotiation attractive to an administration managing this deal. Right now, in the months before November, any renegotiation attempt carries real risk. Reopening a deal that's already stabilized global energy markets and ended an active war risks reigniting exactly the kind of volatility in oil prices and in regional stability that Republicans are already nervous is going to hurt them at the ballot box, given how closely rising costs and fuel prices are already weighing on the electorate's mood heading into this cycle. Renegotiating now would be politically reckless precisely because it would reintroduce uncertainty into an economic picture the administration badly wants to present as resolved and stable through Election Day. But that exact same political logic flips completely once the midterms are actually over. A newly reconstituted Congress, whatever its composition turns out to be, removes the immediate electoral pressure that currently discourages reopening this deal. If Republicans hold their majorities, Trump gains a freer hand and less need to worry about short-term economic disruption costing seats that have already been won. If Republicans lose ground, the political cost of a deal his own base already views skeptically becomes, in some ways, less relevant, because the administration is no longer managing the same immediate electoral exposure either way. Either outcome removes the specific constraint currently holding a renegotiation attempt back. I also don't want to skip past what this means for Iran's own position in all of this, because if Tehran's own negotiators have even a partial read on this dynamic, and there's no particular reason to assume they don't, it fundamentally changes how much good faith Iran has any structural reason to extend during the current 60-day technical negotiating window, covering the disposition of its enriched uranium stockpile. A government that suspects the party on the other side of the table may treat the current framework as provisional, subject to unilateral revision once domestic political conditions shift, has much weaker incentive to make the kind of genuine, verifiable concessions during this window that would actually lock in a durable, permanent settlement. Why negotiate the hard details in good faith if the entire framework you're negotiating within might get discarded and replaced in 5 months, regardless of what you do? That's not a hypothetical concern. That's precisely the kind of asymmetric incentive structure that has derailed multiple previous rounds of American-Iranian diplomacy across the past year, where Trump himself was documented, by one network's count, claiming a deal was imminent at least 38 separate times between March and June, before an actual agreement was finally reached. Let's zoom out from the immediate political mechanics and look at what this reveals about the wider structural problem with how this entire negotiation has unfolded from the start. This deal was never actually a single, clean negotiation. It was the eventual product of months of collapsed talks, unconditional surrender demands, postponed ultimatums, a brief war that closed one of the world's most important shipping choke points, and finally, a memorandum of understanding that even the vice president himself described publicly as only about a page and a half long, deliberately leaving enormous swaths of technical detail to be worked out later. An agreement built this way, through this much chaos and this much deferred detail, was always going to face a harder test of durability than a deal negotiated through a single, coherent, unified process from the start. The current reporting about a possible post-election pivot isn't really a new development so much as it's the entirely predictable next chapter of a negotiation that's been characterized by exactly this kind of instability at every previous stage. There's a deeper pattern worth naming plainly here, because it connects this specific report to a much larger story about how modern great power diplomacy increasingly gets conducted. Agreements negotiated primarily to resolve an acute, market-rattling crisis, rather than to establish a genuinely durable long-term settlement, tend to carry exactly this kind of structural fragility built into them from the outset, because the negotiating incentive at the moment of signature is overwhelmingly about stopping the immediate bleeding rather than solving the underlying dispute. The Strait of Hormuz needed to reopen. Oil markets needed to stabilize. A war that had already produced direct American military strikes inside Iranian territory needed an off-ramp. All of those were genuinely urgent, genuinely important goals, and the deal achieved them. But achieving urgent short-term stabilization and achieving durable long-term resolution are not the same accomplishment. And this is precisely the distinction that gets collapsed every time a deal like this gets celebrated, as though the underlying dispute has actually been settled, rather than simply paused. I'd also flag something about how this specific report is likely to get covered, because it shapes how you're probably already thinking about it before I even said a word. Coverage of this kind of story tends to split immediately along predictable partisan lines, with critics of the current deal treating the report as vindication that the agreement was flawed from the start, and defenders of the deal dismissing it as unfounded speculation from a single foreign newspaper with no independent confirmation from anyone inside the administration. Both of those framings are, in a sense, beside the point. What actually matters isn't whether this specific report turns out to be precisely accurate in every detail. It's that the underlying political conditions this report describes, real dissatisfaction from key Republican senators, a genuine structural tension between this deal's terms and the coalition that elected this administration, and a midterm election calendar that changes the incentive structure around renegotiation before and after November, are all independently verifiable and all point in the same direction, regardless of whether this particular story's sourcing holds up perfectly. So let's bring this back to the question I opened with. Is Trump actually planning a new Iran deal after the elections? Here's my honest structural answer, and I want you to notice this isn't a simple answer, because simple answers are usually wrong when there's this much genuine uncertainty layered on top of this many competing incentives. I don't think anyone outside a very small circle inside this administration currently knows the answer to that question with real confidence, including, quite possibly, some of the people who would eventually be responsible for executing a renegotiation if one were pursued. What we can say with confidence is that the structural conditions that would make a post-election renegotiation attractive are genuinely present, that meaningful factions inside Trump's own governing coalition remain unsatisfied with the current deal's terms, and that Trump's own public insistence that the midterms aren't shaping his Iran strategy is exactly the kind of statement leaders tend to make specifically when that possibility has already become a live consideration worth publicly denying. There's one more piece of this I want to give you before we get to the forecast, and it's the piece almost nobody outside specialist Iran-watching circles is talking about. What genuine uncertainty about this deal's permanence does to every other actor currently operating under its framework, independent of whether a renegotiation ever actually happens. Israeli officials, already deeply uncomfortable with a deal that leaves Iran able to continue enriching uranium at reduced levels and that appears to have tied their hands regarding operations in Lebanon, now have real incentive to simply wait out the current framework rather than adjust their own strategic posture around it as though it were durable. Gulf partners being asked to help fund reconstruction commitments have incentive to move cautiously with actual capital deployment until they have more confidence the underlying framework will still exist in its current form a year from now. Iran's own leadership, weighing how much of its enrichment infrastructure to genuinely dismantle during the technical negotiation window, has incentive to hedge rather than commit fully. A deal that everyone treats as provisional functions very differently in practice than a deal everyone treats as settled, even if the text on the page never actually changes. Now let me give you my actual forecast, because I don't think an analysis is complete until it makes a falsifiable prediction, something you can hold me to. First, watch whether the 60-day technical negotiation window covering Iran's enriched uranium stockpile produces a specific, verifiable disposition plan on schedule, or whether it gets extended, delayed, or quietly left ambiguous. A window that closes without a concrete, verifiable outcome is itself a leading indicator that neither side currently has strong incentive to lock in permanent terms. Second, watch whether any of the Republican senators who've already criticized this deal publicly escalate that criticism into concrete legislative action, such as attempts to condition sanctions relief on congressional approval in the months before November. Escalating legislative pressure from inside the president's own party would be a much stronger signal than continued rhetorical criticism alone. Third, watch whether actual private sector or regional partner capital begins flowing into the $300 billion reconstruction fund on any verifiable timeline, or whether that commitment remains, months after signature, mostly theoretical. Real capital deployment would suggest genuine institutional confidence in the deal's durability. Continued absence of deployed capital would suggest the opposite. Fourth, watch Trump's own public rhetoric about Iran specifically in the weeks immediately following the midterm results, whichever way they go. A notable shift in tone toward either renewed pressure or renewed negotiation within days of the election results being finalized would be a strong signal that electoral considerations were indeed shaping the administration's patience with the current framework, regardless of what was said publicly beforehand. And fifth, the big one to close the forecast on. Watch whether any formal, on-record confirmation of post-election renegotiation planning emerges from inside the administration itself in the coming months, as opposed to remaining confined to anonymously sourced reporting from outside outlets. I would not be surprised, and I want to be explicit about this so you can hold me to it, if we see exactly this kind of confirmation surface sometime in the weeks immediately following the midterms, dressed up as a natural next phase of an evolving relationship with Iran, rather than an admission that the current deal was always considered provisional. One last indicator worth adding, softer than the others but worth watching regardless. Pay attention to how Iranian state media and Iranian officials respond specifically to this Telegraph report, if they respond to it at all. A dismissive or notably muted reaction would suggest Tehran either hasn't seen this as credible or has already priced in exactly this kind of uncertainty into its own negotiating posture. A sharp, defensive, or unusually detailed rebuttal would suggest the report touched a nerve that Iranian officials feel compelled to address directly, which would itself be a meaningful signal about how seriously Tehran is taking the possibility described. Here's what I want you to take away from this more than any single prediction. The instinct to ask whether this deal is finished or not finished is a battlefield-era instinct, built for a world where agreements either represent the final word or don't represent anything at all. This deal, negotiated in the middle of chaos, deliberately left thin on detail, and immediately contested by meaningful voices inside the very coalition that produced it, was never built to be read as a final word. It was built to buy time, stop a war, and reopen a choke point, and it succeeded at exactly that. Whether it also succeeds at the much harder task of surviving contact with an American election cycle is a genuinely open question, and the honest answer right now is that nobody, including quite possibly the people who negotiated it, actually knows. If you've made it this far, you now understand this report better than most of the people currently either dismissing it as baseless speculation or treating it as confirmed fact. Because you're not asking whether Trump will definitely seek a new deal after the elections. You're asking what structural conditions would make that outcome likely, who benefits from the current uncertainty persisting, and how every other actor operating inside this deal is already adjusting their own behavior in response to that same uncertainty, whether or not the renegotiation itself ever actually happens. Those are the questions that will actually determine whether this framework becomes a durable regional settlement or simply the first of several attempts at one. And they're worth revisiting the moment the midterm results are actually in, because that's when this question stops being speculative and starts being testable against real decisions rather than anonymously sourced reporting. I'll be tracking all 5 of those indicators I just gave you in future videos. So if this kind of structural breakdown is useful to you, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.